Thanks very much for the opportunity to share our thoughts and concerns about topics that I think can be legitimately described as hot, as very topical. Before I start, I think I might have 2 minutes for that. Before I start, a bit of background. Neither Mike nor I have any background in neuroscience as such. We have very different backgrounds. Mike in institutional theory, organizational practice, and I'm a psychologist. The whole adventure delving into organizational neuroscience was when I got really upset about a paper that I read, and I felt, you are making claims in this paper, and you're making assumptions about so-called desirable brain profiles that for me raise significant ethical issues. And I immersed myself further in the topic, and I wrote a paper. It got rejected a few times, eventually accepted, and in the end the journal suggested to turn this into an exchange paper with some prominent advocates of the field. And that's basically, the talk today is primarily based on the starting paper of that exchange. If you're interested in the paper, it's published or it's in press in the Journal of Management Inquiry. So, without further ado, I should start. Where's the mouse? Right. Right. What I do today, I quickly discuss why neuroscience is so appealing, and then I move on to trying to tease out the ethical implications it has for the neuroscientific study of leadership. I provide a few examples, and then I draw to a close with some further reflections that I hope you may be finding rewarding listening to. Right, okay. So where does the whole appeal, the whole attractiveness come from? So by taking out the social component and moving into the brain, with our reliance on, as people say, objective, reliable data, we in the pursuit of getting over the so-called physics, and we can rely on the heart's natural science, and we can pursue the subject of leadership, which is a highly contested subject, with more rigor and greater validity and certainty. And then some advocates then say that if we integrate cognitive neuroscience knowledge with the leadership theories, it will bring us closer to understanding what constitutes leadership. And what they probably should have said more precisely is what constitutes good leadership. Now, if you make that move from traditional ways of examining leadership by way of interviews, questionnaires, etc., to that of hard, reliable, objective brain scans, the prospect of offering that predictor with more certainty falls on a very fertile soil in a climate of economic crisis. How can we make sure we employ the best methods available to predict leadership success in a multiple of outcomes? So it is increased. It's a fallacy of this increased validity or certainty, trustworthiness, with which I can, in a way, sell my research to companies, and particularly in the US. If you browse the internet, you will be shocked sometimes the kind of nonchalant ways of portraying the benefits without any underlying critical scrutiny. This is what you can do by using neuroscience, and it's really worrying. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one source of motivation for us. This is great concern to engage in this kind of work. Yeah. And I hinted at that already. If the advocates that now use neuroscience to the study and apply it to leadership, they say, well, the utility surely arises because traditional predictors don't account for more than 10% of variance. It's interesting, it's a paper by Wardman and colleagues in the Academy of Management Perspectives, which is a high-profile outlet for us. There's an irony here, because they say, well, traditional ways of predicting leadership often don't give us more than 10% of variance. At the same time, their study on brain coherence actually shows that their biggest variance explained is 10%. There's a bit of an irony here, which we surely can incorporate in one of our forthcoming papers. And for that particular paper, they are very clear that we can use neuroscience as a way to develop, first identify and then develop effective leadership. It's an interesting connotation here, effective leadership, in their paper. Effective leadership is synonymous with inspirational leadership. And they say that's the most successful form, or the most widely researched form of effective leadership. Interesting enough, there are now challenges to that view, but for them, it's a clear-cut case. On the predictor side, yes, brain activity can predict, and on the outcome variable side, and of course, yeah, inspiration leadership is the most effective form of leadership. But as we can see now, there are problems on both the predictor side and the outcome side. So, and the basic reasoning in the paper is that brain activities associated with particular leadership capabilities, we can identify them using neuroscience. And once we have identified them, we can start to develop, by way of intervention, more effective leadership behaviors. That is, inspirational leadership behaviors. So, my concern was that in the rush of leaping on to this latest technological development, that we have literally glossed over, ignored, neglected, forgotten what our responsibility is in the production of knowledge. And that's the key concern that I had with the paper, and I want to articulate these in more detail on the following slides. The first key differentiator is that, okay, I'm not denying that neuroscience hasn't got any merits. No, I'm fine if we use it for therapeutic purposes. And it is interesting to note that all the advocates refer to many therapeutic or clinical studies to show or to underline the case for using, for instance, neurofeedback sessions to develop different leadership behaviors, even though the studies they refer to dealt with the elimination of anxiety or hypertension. Yeah? So there's an important distinction to be made between clinical applications and applications that serve enhancement purposes. And when we talk about enhancement, what often shines through is higher performance at whatever level, individual, group, organization, etc. Higher performance is key. Following, or in the pursuit of this kind of thinking, particularly this is a Wortman paper, what they say is that what this induces, and I'm very clear on that in the paper, is that once we buy into the view that we can use a neuroscience to identify leaders, we take it further to intervention purposes, to remedy those brain profiles that don't fit our expectations, that we think are not conducive to our organizational ends. And then they say, okay, I mentioned it before, they link effective leadership to inspirational leadership. The uninspirational leader, of course, if you take the reverse of that, is ineffective. So what we have to do is turn that uninspirational leader into an inspirational leader in order for him or her to be effective. So, I mentioned before, there's a difficulty here with just accepting the blanket verdict that inspiration is the most effective form of leadership. But also, it pathologizes individuals that are not necessarily, that cannot or should not necessarily be considered in terms of their pathology. Now, I may be uninspirational. I may have a tendency to get angry sometimes, which seems to be in contradiction with the inspiration leadership literature, but doesn't mean that I'm unhealthy. Where does the moral justification come from for that kind of development? And my concern is that it effectively pathologizes those that can be considered healthy but are ineffective. They don't fit the kind of description that we have, or the image we have of an inspiration leader, and how we think this person will enhance our organizational performance or individual performance. So, and to be more specific on the last point, what the study basically suggests, that if you have a physiological insignificant lack of heightened activity in a particular brain area, the right frontal lobe, in that case, it means basically you're not an inspiration leader. And then the only impression I got from the paper is that, well, if you argue this way, you say that this is a kind of socially undesirable behavior or a condition. And because it's socially undesirable, we have to do something about it. And then they start subjecting these leaders to interventions, especially in neurofeedback sessions. To interject an interesting remark from a student recently, sometimes they say something really, really clever, and that was very, very rewarding. She said, okay, this study used 50 business executives. If they're executives, one way or another, they should have some qualities of a leader. It's an imperfect argument, I admit that, but still it made me think of, okay, if they're not good at what they're doing, why are they there where they are? So I found that a very interesting comment that the student made there. I was too quick there. I had contact once with this US scholar, Wardman, and I asked him a few questions. He didn't like me asking him the questions. And for him in an email, and he was very, very, how can I put it? He was very abrupt, almost offended by the fact that they're asking him a few questions about the ethics of the research. And he was very frank that, why do you kick up such a fuss about it? Whether the use of neuroscience is ethically sensitive is more an empirical issue rather than a philosophical or an ideological issue. And he said basically we should examine the participants' responses to feelings of being part of the research program, and then see whether any ethical issues arise here. What is interesting to note that the advocates of organizational neuroscience are very, very good at disarming any criticism on the surface. We still hope we can get them somewhere. But concerns such as those articulated in these papers, or the concerns that we have in the accumulations paper that's not being published online, regularly brushed off the table. Our philosophy, ideology. Why bother? Now, intangible phenomena, inexpressible. We should look into the brain to understand human nature. Which is a bit of a strange thing to say, because it just privileges their views and seeks to stifle dissent. And I'm not feeling very happy with that. It always does something in me. Makes me go to the keyboard and write. I mentioned that point before already. So let's share a few examples. And we can. I'd like to invite you to relish these examples, like you would relish a piece of chocolate that's melting in your mouth. So the first paper. There's no innuendo in the end, okay? The first paper, Goldman and Boyatzis. Boyatzis is actually a writing mate of our dean. I have to be careful with that. It's a paper I published in the Harvard Business Review, and they say the following. Individuals, when it comes to the application of neuroscience, they should do the following. This is a double quote, undergo a thorough diagnostic assessment akin to a medical workup. Now, the medical workup I put into italics. to identify social weaknesses and strengths, etc. And then the last point, the greatest benefit for the organization. So it is not really about how you as a person might be feeling better at work. It is about how can we make you feel in order for us to benefit more from your contribution. Yeah? And again, it's another interesting point where we can see that individual interests and organization interests often do not converge on the same objectives. So that's the first one. Now that's my favorite, uncontested favorite. Right. So Wortmann, I'm sure we will be close friends at some point, suggests that activities in the right frontal brain region set apart inspirational from non-inspirational leaders. And you have to really read this very carefully. So let's say, and I quote, "We have found a small group of managers to have one or more brain profile deficiencies. Unfortunately, such a condition can limit an individual from reaching his or her leadership potential, including being seen as inspiration in the eyes of others. So, I think this is really, really key. They come up with this notion of a brain profile deficiency because you are not inspirational, but you have a deficiency. There's an interesting tension emerging here. The ones that have these brain profile deficiencies, and I have, I think, a further example in a bit, are then subjected to neurofeedback sessions, and then it is claimed that yes, we have turned someone uninspirational into someone inspirational. It is a flagship management journal, and I read the method section time and time again, and I wondered, where the hell is the control group? No control group. Basically a violation of basic design issues. A pre-test, post-test experiment with interjected interventions for the experimental group didn't take place. Yet they say, okay, we had someone who had an anger management problem, we subjected him to a number of neurofeedback sessions, and poof, miraculously, he was more inspirational. It's really, really hard to believe that this got published. With regard to the neurofeedback sessions, I think that they literally said that this person was weak in managing his anger, and following the number of neurofeedback sessions, we could correct the problem. So they didn't tell us how many neurofeedback sessions. And from the design issues, I think it's the suggestion that this has happened must be taken with a pinch of salt. Say a big pinch of salt. So, to move on. To expand on the examples, I think it's clear that the neurofeedback sessions or the therapy was solely orchestrated for the benefit of organization, even though the person may have behaved in day-to-day life relatively normally. And I also wonder, what does this happen? Okay, I'm using no, that I'm being tagged, I shouldn't probably use names here. But imagine that you are married, wife, husband, whatever, to someone who is normally very introvert, uninspirational, and all of a sudden, following this kind of therapy, this person comes back as a, I don't know, Tony Blair rather than Gordon Brown. Now I said the name. So, what's the impact here for the ecology of the family, for friendship, for friends that were your friends because you were you then, but all of a sudden someone is thinking around with your behavior, with your brain, and I think this just raises enormous ethical questions. So if we take this further, looking at the last point, in defining uninspirational leadership in terms of pathology, or more exactly speaking, a brain profile deficiency, we end up in a situation where we define business goals in terms of pathology that we have to get rid of. I feel personally very, very uncomfortable with that. Very, very uncomfortable. I don't want to draw to a close here with conclusion, bullet points. I think if I leave you with a number of questions that maybe perhaps hopefully more stimulating. So the first one that I thought is really pressing is, where does actually the moral authority come from? And how dare they professing to have this moral authority? Who has the authority to stipulate what is the kind of desirable brain profile? That was one of the main questions that occurred to me. And I think it's also looked, particularly from a sociological point of view in the future, to look at discrimination in the workplace. If the progress or the uptake of this technology continues at this speed, maybe sooner or later we find ourselves in a situation where people are actively discriminated based on their brain profiles, however they look like. I just, in the paper, I said, okay, you start with this kind of inspirational leadership behavior. How about attitude to coming late to work, willingness to work overtime, loyalty to the company? And I was very shocked when I read this paper in a management review special issue, where they actually say we should use neuroscience to explore organizational desired behaviors, if they have plagiarized my term. I'm sure they didn't. And those that are not necessarily desired, such as counterproductive work behaviors. And boom, you have created this kind of thought police. Greetings from George Orwell, 1984. So, yeah. Leaving publication pressures aside, what does it leave actually us? Do we advance something in ethically responsible ways when it comes to this line of inquiry? And the other ethical issue that occurred to me, and I'm sure there are many more, is once the notion of undesirable brain profiles sinks into our psyche, to what extent do we see a kind of marginalization of those people in the workforce? And then again, that would link back to this discrimination that I hinted at earlier. I'm not sure how the format will continue. Questions and answers now, or shall Mike continue now?
I think perhaps it might continue, then we'll open it up for discussion across both of us.
So I'm happy to hand over the floor to Mike.
You're a leader. You're obviously a leader.
He is. Tremendously inspirational.
Yeah.
And we have the ubiquitous head with the areas on as well. We just have to depict it once just to make sure that we all know what it's about. I'd like to talk about something a little bit more perhaps technical and something that's concerned us, because what we try to do then, because we're both labouring with this idea, this urge to do something about it, to try to get a grip of why this may be problematic over and beyond having a feeling that there's something going on that may be not right. And thus we try to cobble together an argument that not only to us makes sense, but it also demonstrates perhaps some of the problems that we felt, but weren't quite able to articulate in the first place, were undermining perhaps this idea. Or so much seemed wrong. And some of the critiques we found, the dominant critiques, seem to get hung up quite a lot on philosophically sounding arguments. And as Dirk has said, arguments that were quite easily brushed away. So stuff like consciousness. And then you go, oh, it's just fluffy stuff, isn't it? We don't want fluffy stuff, we want science. And oops, you go, you've lost your argument. So what we did is we looked at the process of reductionism. Because what happens in there is predominantly a process of reducing and playing around with this. So let's have a look at how this goes then. So what's the premise? And I do repeat Dirk a little bit there. The premise of this whole thing, the underlying argument, is that organizational neuroscience allows us to dissect specific social process at a neurobiological level and apply a wider range of analysis to specific organizational research. It can elucidate particular networks of the brain and processes responsible for workplace attitudes, behaviors that organizational scholars have observed. Neuroscience can thus allow us to go finally inside the brain and investigate the primal causes of behavior. And then we come across questions that as a rhetorically stipulated, we take it, such as, can this revolutionize the way inspirational leaders are identified and developed? So that's the premise, right? So we reduce something from higher level and work with it at a lower level. So this logic entails a twofold movement. An arrow going down, an arrow going up again. First, we deconstruct what happens when sociologists, or ethnographers, or organization theorists go out and observe things, and you speak to people, into smaller brain processes. And then you reconstruct them, reconstitute them into the higher level explanations. And you mess with them or analyze them at the low level, that's where your intervention goes, and you play it back onto the big screen. That's this logic. Okay, so this is what's quite firmly agreed as well, or quite firmly argued, that this standard process of reductionism is what we should strive for. It's the proper goal of science, apparently. Now, what's wrong with this, or what should at least give us some cause for concern? Now, this is an MRI scanner, I'm being told. It's a clunky machine made by Siemens, this one. And what happens with the individual, the leader, I take it, will be strapped into a device, this is for the head by the way, and then sort of maneuvered into this great magnet where all kind of processes are going on to identify and create images of what happens inside the brain. Now technology has advanced tremendously. If you think back quite a few years ago, it would have been necessary to cut someone's skull open to see what's going on inside. And then went through a process of quite rudimentary imaging, that, quite static pictures. Whereas now we've moved with these kind of machines to live images, so you can see pulsations of different colours of what happens when brains are stimulated. So the first step involves this kind of apparatus. And what the second step is, and curiously this step is talked about very little, is a step where people, organizational neuroscientists, sit there and look at pictures. What we can't see is they may point as well at pictures. And in looking and pointing, they will make sense of these kind of diagrams and pictures and relate them back to some sort of socially meaningful phenomena. Now what we see here is a methods assemblage, or an apparatus. The Sociology of Science and Technology has created a number of, John Law, Anne Raymond and others, Karen Barrett have created a number of terms that are used to describe the translations that happen therein, Grün Natur, etc. What we see is a quite technologically driven, scientific, medical process. And what we come out with is stuff like this. Now this is pretty random. I just looked through a number of blocks in and around Nature. I'm not sure if you can read. I'll read some highlights out for you. Lighter sentences for murderer with bad genes. Brain scans predict which criminals are more likely to re-offend. Science in court. Neuroscience shows that the adolescent brain is still developing. The question is whether that should influence the sentencing of juveniles. Italian court reduces murder sentence based on neuroimaging data. Brain scans predict which criminals are more likely to re-offend. Science in court, head case. Another case in Italy where neuroscience was used to reduce or not sentences. Now, so this is the penal and legal system. And we see proliferation of these approaches in loads of different spheres. So we work together with a colleague in Nottingham who does research on family, policy area, care, social care, and more children are being scanned. And the argument goes that these scans help to identify children who have been abused. And so they may be used in cases where the decision is to be made whether they're taken away from families. So these kind of images may help a lawyer, a judge, to make a decision whether or not actual abuse has happened. Please.
So can I just have clarification?
Yes.
Do you mean that it's brain scans that are being used to detect whether a child has been abused?
I'm not sure if detect is right, but they're used as part of the evidence, as we understand it.
Brain scans rather than other types?
Yeah. There's the so-called Allen
Wow.
report commissioned by the UK government,
Wow.
and the verdict is clear that this offers reliable evidence in order to detect when a child has suffered from prolonged neglect or abuse.
It is not. It will not. At the moment, at least, it's not the only piece of evidence. I suppose that this happens in particular when there are other indicators being flagged up. But we could easily imagine. I mean, Britain's not particularly hesitant when it comes to setting up big databases of these kind of things. So big screening ideas in schools and infant, at a different level could be quite easily matchable, especially when these machines become widespread. Curiously, I've often wondered how much such a machine costs, where there may be quite a lot of lobbyists about making.
Sorry but can I just follow up? So this has been used as evidence for social services.
Yeah, to inform
And it
social
has been
policy.
used in cases where children have been taken from their family. Or is there just a discussion about this?
It is proposed.
Okay.
We have to speak to David. I'm not sure if it has been
David
used.
will know more, but the case is that this is an argument that is being matured and developed.
Sure.
The fact that the UK government has commissioned now 2 reports on it would suggest this particular interest in taking this further.
Sure.
And we can see that has been used in other contexts already. So you can see it spreading across different services and different aspects of life. The Army, interestingly, is one of the key funders of neuroscientific research, and I'm sure that it will be used there. I mean, we can imagine, I'm not sure of course, but we can imagine that a lot of stuff is being used in and around preparing people for war situations, or even post-war regeneration and so on, stuff that we may not quite see at the moment. So
And they may frame it as a quest for inspiration leaders
Of course.
to enhance the performance of the platoon. But in the same way, once you go down that route, you can just look at people that completely lack empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is another thing
If
maybe
you believe in
desirable in the
science.
context of the military.
If you believe in the science, that's the question I'll be asked it in.
Yeah.
okay. And in a sense, where we got in then is to, because what we can see as well, I mean, you see different areas this starting, and of course, as soon as money is involved, and the idea that we can use this not only to prevent crimes or protect society or identify potential crimes in criminals, but as soon as the commercial context is involved, this whole thing generates a new dimension. Yeah? There's a generative mechanism in there as soon as lots of money is involved. And we can see how, as Dirk has said, how enticing the offer is, that we are finally able, now with the new technologies that we have, to pin down what makes us successful. And this will be not used only by academics then, it will be quite likely spread out into all kind of consultancy and so on and so forth, and HR departments, etc. So this is where we came in, and this was our basic starting point. So, and this is what we read as well. This is our reading of the literature. Look, it's happened elsewhere. This is the technology. It's tremendously advanced. It's happening elsewhere quite successfully, and if it works there, clearly we should be doing it. So, in that paper at least, our question was, so what on earth is happening? How can we understand these processes of reduction and reconstitution, perhaps from a social science perspective, from a philosophical perspective, and what kind of problems emerge in there? So what on earth do we reduce when we reduce? It's probably one of the first questions. And we followed 3 avenues. And there are many others to follow perhaps, but this is one way that made sense for us. And the first one is to say, well, what may very well be the case is that we try to reduce theory. So it may help us to reduce our theories through the use of neuroscience. Now, if you look at and this is an example that Dirk mentioned already, but also an example that's used quite often by organizational neuroscientists. For instance, take the idea of leadership discrimination. So we may be able to detect leadership discrimination. Now, in a sociological arena, we may have theories about discrimination that involve an awful lot of different stuff, loads of different variables. First of all, there are loads of different manifestations of what discrimination could be. It could entail jokes. You could be shouted at, or the absence thereof. So you could be neglected, you could be bypassed. There may be rumours behind your back, so oblique forms of discrimination, and so on and so forth. Discrimination, furthermore, changed throughout the history. So process that used to be quite commonplace may now be regarded as totally out of order and discriminatory. So we have a sense for the history, we have a sense for what was considered glacials at the time, but also of changes in the law as well as in governance structures in organizations. So who's in influence, what is the kind of control mechanism built into an organization? Got to do with social status, with class, education, with the foundations of that some people become managers, others not, and they first come to position to discriminate, and so on and so forth. So we see there's a lot of stuff going on. Now, this is a problem, arguably, because complexity is tremendous. Organizations are complex things. And let me indulge for 1 second. I just want to show you a picture, because there seems to be this idea that we can reduce this complexity to neuroscientific processes, that we can reduce this massive map into a few smaller, quite straightforwardly related variables. Let me give you a picture of what an organization looks like, perhaps. This is a Swiss artist called Zundel, and he builds these funny machines where you don't quite know which bit connects to the next. And I think this is quite a neat little way of looking at the kind of complexity that we face in organization. But it doesn't stop there. Let's have a look at this machine in action. So what we see here is this machine drives around in social context. And we see how pedestrians react to it, how other traffic reacts to it, and how the level of complexity is increased once this organisation that we look at as the act of organising something is let loose within other organisations, within customers, within legal process and so on. So it's a bloody mess. Yeah? Organisation studies, social life is heavily complex. It's ambiguous. Any concept trying to capture the complexity necessarily affords various interpretation, adding to the complexity. In addition, it's recursive. So there's not necessarily straightforward, linear causality, but yeah, there may be things that have happened in the past that crop up, and so both past and future remain in a curious sense unknowable. And what we have is, in a way, this condition that we have, as you're sociologists at least, and a few sociologists here, and organization theorists have understood, this is the way we come to understand this. The promise is that we can reduce this to brain activity, sequential brain impulses in particular areas. That's the idea. And we can see how appealing it is, to get rid of this mess and just have a few straightforwardly measurable instances. Sorry, that was too quick. Now, the problem with this is that when we have sequential brain impulses, we have firing and non-firing of neurons in particular areas of the brain. Once we identify these in certain graphs, where's the joke? Where's the shouting gone? Where's the neglect? Where are rumours? Where's all the other stuff? So we have a difference in the language used, but also a difference in the kind of logic of the concepts. And we have to bridge these somehow. So to make sure that the firing, non-firing of a neuron in a particular area means a joke, we have to add another stipulation and say that, oh, well, if this happens in this area, this time, in this context, then this here signifies that. So we have to generate what Nagel calls a bridge law that bridges the two. And what we do then is, instead of explaining that, we add another layer of complexity. And a third layer because we have to relate the two. So problems in terms of theory reduction are immense. And there's another one. Not only is the vocabulary different, what happens if we see a 50% increase in brain activity indicating that leadership discrimination is going on? So someone is more discriminating as a leader. But what does it mean? 50% more here does not mean 50% more there. I've been shouted at in my work not university of course, but before, but I've never been shouted at 50% more than before. Yeah, so the logics are difficult. So theory reduction is quite problematic. Yet, we may not even do theory reduction, we may be a bit more wholehearted and say another form of reductionism is that we reduce everything, called ontological or constitutive reductionism. This is much more radical, a form of materialism, a radical materialism, where we say that there is nothing but brain activity. And if you change brain activity, then we change leadership. Yeah, there's a one-to-one relationship, a supervenience, Davidson calls it, between the two spheres. This is what is invoked by many of the studies that Dirk has mentioned before. Yet even here, we find a number of problems. The one big one that everyone mentions is consciousness. Where on earth is consciousness? If we are just material things, if we are just brain processes, what makes us human? So vitalists used to search for this extra principle. Now this is really interesting, but it's not a route that we wanted to pursue because it's so easily brushed away. And it becomes a philosophical argument of belief and not, and so on and so forth. But what is curious about it is, even if we accept that we are just material things, what does it mean for those studying these material things? Aren't they also then just brain patterns? What puts an organization neuroscientist into the position to go beyond just being a bundle of synapses and neuron flashes? How can we interpret a picture? Don't we have to stop at saying that's the picture? It's a bundle of brain activities looking at a bundle of brain activities. Don't talk about leadership. Yeah? So that we find there's a certain almost Hippocratic element in there. And the second, of course, is that even if we are just our brains, even if we are just biological processes, for these to be meaningful, they have to represent something. This is a picture of Descartes' view of how the pineal gland contains the representations of the world and so on. So, but it contains the representation of something outside the brain. So it's aboutness. There's an intentionality in there without which the whole thing makes very little sense. So we have a real problem here in this radical ontological substitution. So if you really think the two are the same, there are lots of questions to be answered. And yet this is the biggest one perhaps. This is where we can see a lot of leadership work going on. Because if you say the two are the same, you can intervene and you can manipulate people quite readily. Okay, doke. I'll hurry up a bit. The third one, and that's perhaps a less harsh one or a less strong one than the ontological one, is if we just say the two explanations, the explanations on the higher and lower level match. So we can explain things that go on the social sphere with things that go on in the brain, even without making these strong ontological links. But even there we find a number of problems. And I'm German and trying to do a joke, so forgive me. And it's not funny. Okay, who's the most emotional woman in the world? Amy Chida. Amygdala. It's that brain area that holds emotions. Okay, we had a couple of little laughs. That was very generous. Let's try to be funny again. Who's the most emotional woman in the world? No one laughs. Okay, let's be funny again. So what we have here is what we can call a multiple realization problem. Even though I tried to be funny 3 times, and I'm crap at it, and it wasn't really funny the first time, the second time there was no social effect. The third time the effect was reversed, and you got bored and you thought, oh, what's going on? So even though we may have a leader having exactly the same brain pattern, trying to do the same thing, through repetition, through the very normal process of learning and affirmation, as Bexley calls it for instance, we have very different social responses. So there's a really big problem in trying to explain the two. And we can have a look at this in terms of a very old-fashioned typewriter. How it works, how for instance this little button works that produces capital letters, tells us very little about how capital letters are used in the grammar of language. One is a precondition, the other one is governed by a socially negotiated idea a language game, if you wish, or any other process that is quite devoid or quite detached from this. And let me just, it's beautiful. There's Elena's here. I have to say something about the Greeks. Diogenes of Apollonia said that the soul of all animals was air. That air was what thought really is. That air is what steers and rules all things, including animals. So you're all made of air because air has a particular lightness, a property that makes it suitable for producing movement. So in these and other cases, the demand for explanation of an animal movement is answered not with reference to desires, perceptions, beliefs, or striving, but by mentioning properties of some physiological entity, in virtue of which the entity is capable of imparting, causing movement. However, what we do when we say that air makes us move, makes us think, is we confuse the two, the precondition with the effect. Yeah? Just because I eat fruit every day doesn't mean that I'm a fruitcake. It does perhaps, but yeah, there are different explanations at different levels of the social sphere. And we can't just explain the one with the other without running into these kind of very fundamental problems. And the last one, and that's Dirk's doing, comes from...
that picture.
That's Dirk, last night. That comes from experimental psychology, which introduced a very peculiar twist, because rather than saying the brain is the originator of thought, the body sometimes has been found to generate brain patterns or certain emotions. So getting the fetal position may trigger a certain brain response. So this actually causes the brain, not the other way around. So the causal arrow suddenly is reversed, or at least questioned, which renders the whole idea of causing, explaining through smaller reductions a higher level phenomenon quite problematic. So, what do we reduce? Theory, things, explanations? And what does it mean when we try to do that stuff in the organizational context? I don't know. I think it's worrying. That's it, I'm afraid. I haven't got questions at the end. Okay, thank you.